Hello, everyone. We are reading chapter 11 today of The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And chapter 11 is called The Interior of the Heart. So at the very end of 10, we discover for sure that Dimmesdale is the father. He's definitely been hiding something. Chillingworth finds it at the end of 10. And so 11 is just sort of an update, and we're talking more about Dimmesdale and sort of what life is like for him. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything else I have to tell you before we start. After the incident last described, so the one where Chillingworth opened up Dimmesdale's shirt and found something, the intercourse between the clergyman and the physician, though externally the same, was really of another character than it had previously been. The intellect of Roger Chillingworth had now a sufficiently plain path before it. It was not, indeed, precisely that which he had laid out for himself to tread. Calm, gentle, passionless as he appeared, there was yet, we fear, a quiet depth of malice hitherto latent, but active now, in this unfortunate old man, which led him to imagine a more intimate revenge than any mortal had ever wreaked upon an enemy. So, since Chillingworth found out that Dimmesdale's the guy that he's after, he outwardly seems the same as far as like his actions. He sounds the same. But there's this quiet depth of malice. He has a clear path to his enemy, and so he plans what Hawthorne says would be possibly the worst revenge possible, because it's the most intimate. To make himself the one trusted friend to whom should be confided all the fear, the remorse, the agony, the ineffectual repentance, the backward rush of sinful thoughts expelled in vain. All that guilty sorrow hidden from the world whose great heart would have pitied and forgiven, to be revealed to him, the pitiless, to him, the unforgiving. All that dark treasure to be lavished on the very man to whom nothing else could so adequately pay the debt of vengeance. So his plan is to become Dimmesdale's closest friend so that he knows everything, and all the things that he would have told the world, or could have told the world, could have told the people who would have forgiven him, who would have allowed him to repent, who would have felt sympathy for him. Instead, Chillingworth's the one who's going to know those things, and he has none of those emotions towards Dimmesdale. He doesn't feel bad for him. He doesn't pity him whatsoever. The clergyman's shy and sensitive reserve had bulked this scheme. So his plan to be... Chillingworth's plan to be Dimmesdale's closest friend is sort of problematic because Dimmesdale doesn't really trust anyone. And because he's so sensitive, Chillingworth's having trouble getting really close to him. Roger Chillingworth, however, was inclined to be hardly, if at all, less satisfied with the aspect of affairs which Providence, using the avenger and his victim for its own purposes, and perchance pardoning where it seemed most to punish, had substituted for his black devices. A revelation, he could almost say, had been granted to him. It mattered little for his object, whether celestial or from what other region. By its aid in all the subsequent relations betwixt him and Mr. Dimmesdale, not merely the external presence, but the very inmost soul of the latter, seemed to be brought out before his eyes, so that he could see and comprehend its every movement. He became thenceforth not a spectator only, but a chief actor in the poor minister's interior world. He could play upon him as he chose. Okay, so once Chillingworth finds out who Dimmesdale is, it says that there was a sort of revelation that has been granted to him. And I'm going to compare this to that sixth sense that Hester said she had, where she could sense the sins in others' hearts. Chillingworth, it says, is able to know what is going on in Dimsdale's inmost soul. So his interior world. Even if Dimsdale doesn't say what he's thinking, Chillingworth knows. Or if he doesn't say what's in his heart, Chillingworth knows. It says that he was granted this revelation. Chillingworth was granted this revelation, and it mattered to him very little where it came from, whether it was celestial, as in heavenly, or from some other region, as in maybe, I don't know, maybe from the devil. And so he uses this gift to torture Dimsdale. He could play upon him as he chose. Would he arouse him with a throb of agony? The victim was forever on the rack. It needed only to know the spring that controlled the engine, and the physician knew it well. Would he startle him with sudden fear? As at the waving of a magician's wand, uprose a grisly phantom, uprose 1,000 phantoms in many shapes of death, or more awful shame, all flocking round about the clergyman and pointing with their fingers at his breast. So the way this reads, Chillingworth could also not just know what Dimsdale was thinking, but he could also cause, I don't know how to say it. He could make him see things or sort of get into his head. That's probably a better way to explain it. All this was accomplished with a subtlety so perfect that the minister, though he had constantly a dim perception of some evil influence watching over him, could never gain a knowledge of its actual nature. True, he looked doubtfully, fearfully even at times, with horror and with bitterness of hatred, at the deformed figure of the old physician, his gestures, his gait, his grizzled beard, his slightest and most indifferent acts. The very fashion of his garments were odious in the clergyman's sight, a token implicitly to be relied on of a deeper antipathy in the breast of the latter than he was willing to acknowledge to himself. For as it was impossible to assign a reason for such distrust and abhorrence, so Mr. Dimsdale, conscious that the poison of one morbid spot was infecting his heart's entire substance, attributed all his presentiments to no other cause. He took himself to task for his bad sympathies in reference to Roger Chillingworth, disregarded the lesson that he should have drawn from them, and did his best to root them out. Unable to accomplish this, he nevertheless, as a matter of principle, continued his habits of social familiarity with the old man, and thus gave him constant opportunities for perfecting the purpose to which, poor, forlorn creature that he was, and more wretched than his victim, the avenger had devoted himself. So in this paragraph, it talks about the fact that Dimsdale, as sensitive as he is, he has this feeling that there's something evil, there's an evil presence around him. But Chillingworth is so good at knowing when Dimsdale is being suspicious that he's very, very subtle. And so while Dimsdale suspects there's something evil around him, he doesn't suspect that it's Chillingworth. At the same time, he has this inexplainable distaste for Chillingworth. He really doesn't like the guy. He can't stand anything about him. Not the way he walks, not his beard, his gestures, the way he dresses. He can't stand him. But he doesn't have any reason why. And so Dimsdale convinces himself that his dislike for Chillingworth is misplaced, and it has to do with the sin that's in his heart. And so basically he blames himself and just basically tells himself it's not right to not like this guy for no reason. And so he forces himself to continue spending time with him, even though he can't stand the guy, because he feels like it's his fault, not Chillingworth's. While thus suffering under bodily disease and gnawed and tortured by some black trouble of the soul and given over to the machinations of his deadliest enemy, the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale had achieved a brilliant popularity in his sacred office. He won it, indeed, in great part by his sorrows. His intellectual gifts, his moral perceptions, his power of experiencing and communicating emotion were kept in a state of preternatural activity by the prick and anguish of his daily life. His fame, though still on its upward slope, already overshadowed the soberer reputations of his fellow clergymen, eminent as several of them were. So Dimmesdale is a really well-liked, really popular minister. He's even more popular than some of the older ministers in town or in the area because he is just so good at conveying emotion, thanks to all of the inner turmoil that he struggles with. There were scholars among them who had spent more years in acquiring abstruse lore connected with the divine profession than Mr. Dimmesdale had lived, and who might well therefore be profoundly versed in such solid and valuable attainments than their youthful brother. There were men, too, of a sturdier texture of mind than his, and endowed with a far greater share of shrewd, hard iron, or granite understanding, which, duly mingled with a fair proportion of doctrinal ingredient, constitutes a highly respectable, efficacious, and unamiable variety of the clerical species. There were others again, true saintly fathers, whose faculties had been elaborated by weary toil among their books, and by patient thought, and etherealized, moreover, by spiritual communications with the better world, into which their purity of life had almost introduced these holy personages, with their garments of mortality still clinging to them. All that they lacked was the gift that descended upon the chosen disciples at Pentecost in tongues of flames, symbolizing, it would seem, not the power of speech in foreign and unknown languages, but that of addressing the whole human brotherhood in the heart's native language. These fathers, otherwise so apostolic, lacked heaven's last and rarest attestation of their office, the tongue of flame. They would have vainly sought, had they ever dreamed of seeking, to express the highest truths through the humblest medium of familiar words and images. Their voices came down afar and indistinctly from the upper heights where they habitually dwelt. Not improbably, it was to this latter class of men that Mr. Dimmesdale, by many of his traits of character, naturally belonged. To the high mountain peaks of faith and sanctity he would have climbed, had not the tendency been thwarted by the burden, whatever it might be, of crime or anguish, beneath which it was his doom to totter. It kept him down on a level with the lowest. Him, the man of ethereal attributes, whose voice the angels might else have listened to and answered. But this very burden it was that gave him sympathies so intimate with the sinful brotherhood of mankind, so that his heart vibrated in unison with theirs and received their pain into itself and sent its own throb of pain through 1,000 other hearts, in gushes of sad, persuasive eloquence. Oftenest persuasive, but sometimes terrible. The people knew not the power that moved them thus. They deemed the young clergyman a miracle of holiness. They fancied him the mouthpiece of heaven's messages of wisdom and rebuke and love. In their eyes, the very ground on which he trod was sanctified. The virgins of his church grew pale around him, victims of a passion so imbued with religious sentiment that they imagined it to be all religion, and brought it openly in their white bosoms as their most acceptable sacrifice before the altar. The aged members of his flock, beholding Mr. Dimmesdale's frame so feeble while they were themselves so rugged in their infirmity, believed that he would go heavenward before them, and enjoined it upon their children that their old bones should be buried close to their young pastor's holy grave. And all this time, perchance, when poor Mr. Dimmesdale was thinking of his grave, he questioned with himself whether the grass would ever grow on it, because an accursed thing must there be buried. Okay, there's a lot in that. All I need to make sure that you gather is that everyone loved him. The older ministers, the younger ministers, the older people in town, the younger people in town, everyone thought this guy was like a saint on earth. The only thing that held him down from, becoming a saint, becoming an angel, was this one sin. It is inconceivable the agony with which this public veneration tortured him. Okay, so veneration, I believe, is on your vocab list, and it talks about how much people respect him, how much they hold him on this pedestal. And according to this, it's torture. Don't you feel bad for him? It's inconceivable, according to Hawthorne, the agony with which this public veneration tortured him. It was his genuine impulse to adore the truth and to reckon all things shadow-like and utterly devoid of weight or value, that had not its divine essence as the life within their life. Then what was he? A substance, or the dimmest of all shadows? He longed to speak out from his own pulpit at the full height of his voice and tell the people what he was. I, whom you behold in these black garments of the priesthood, I who ascend the sacred desk and turn my pale face heavenward, taking upon myself to hold communion in your behalf with the most high omniscience, I in whose daily life you discern the sanctity of Enoch, I whose footsteps, as you suppose, leave a gleam along my earthly track, whereby the pilgrims that shall come after me may be guided to the regions of the blessed. I who have laid the hand of baptism upon your children, I who have breathed the parting prayer over your dying friends, to whom the Amen sounded faintly from a world which they had quitted. I, your pastor, whom you so reverence and trust, am utterly a pollution and a lie. So, just to clarify, Dimmesdale has not just said these things. These are the things that he wishes he could say. He wants to get up on his pulpit and tell the people all of these things. He wants to. More than once, Mr. Dimmesdale had gone into the pulpit with a purpose never to come down its steps until he should have spoken words like those above. More than once, he had cleared his throat and drawn in long, deep, and tremulous breath, which when sent forth again would come burdened with the black secret of his soul. More than once, nay, more than 100 times, he had actually spoken. Spoken! But how? He had told his hearers that he was altogether vile, a viler companion of the vilest, the worst of sinners, an abomination, a thing of unimaginable iniquity, and that the only wonder was that they did not see his wretched body shriveled up before their eyes by the burning wrath of the Almighty. Could there be plainer speech than this? Would not the people start up in their seats by a simultaneous impulse and tear him down out of the pulpit which he defiled? Not so indeed. They heard it all and did but reverence him the more. They little guessed what deadly purport lurked in those self-condemning words. The godly youth, said they among themselves. The saint on earth, alas, if he discerned such sinfulness in his own white soul, what horrid spectacle would he behold in thine or mine? The minister well knew, subtle but remorseful hypocrite that he was, the light in which his vague confession would be viewed. He had striven to put a cheat upon himself by making the avowal of a guilty conscience, but had gained only one other sin, and a self-acknowledged shame, without the momentary relief of being self-deceived. He had spoken the very truth and transformed it into the veriest falsehood, and yet, by the constitution of his nature, he loved the truth and loathed the lie, as few men ever did. Therefore, above all things else, he loathed his miserable self. Okay, so I told you that he wanted to confess, and it tells you that he did actually speak more than once. He went up in the pulpit, and what did he tell them? He told them he was terrible. He was the worst. He was the worst of the worst, a sinner, that God should take him out right there in front of them. The problem is he never told what he did. And so he said these things, and it said, okay, the people they're going to know, they're going to stop talking about how great he is, and he'll feel better because he's confessed, even though he didn't really confess. What happens instead? The exact opposite. The people revere him that much more. They say, oh my goodness, the godly youth, oh my, if he sees himself as such a terrible sinner, then what must he think of us? we are really awful. They still think like they're not worthy because they still see him this way. It goes on to explain that by doing this, Dimsdale really just created another sin for himself because he went up there, he tells himself, "Well, I confessed. It's not my fault that they didn't, you know, change their opinion of me." He knew the whole time that he was saying it, every time that he said it, that he was only giving them part of the truth and that they would take it exactly the way they did, as this, like he was just being humble. And he knew that's how they would take it. So he committed yet another sin, and he never got any relief in the process like he hoped he would. So it tells us there that above everything else, he hates himself. The next part of the book is going to talk about Dimsdale punishing himself. So he does, even though he doesn't hate himself enough to confess, he does hate himself enough that he punishes himself. So pay attention to how he does so. His inward trouble drove him to practices more in accordance with the old corrupted faith of Rome than with the better light of the church in which he had been born and bred. So he does things that are closer to the old corrupted faith of Rome. What would that faith be? The Roman Catholics. So he follows some of the practices of Roman Catholicism, which were pretty strict, and so Hawthorne's going to list some of the things that he does that the Roman Catholics would have done. In Mr. Dimsdale's secret closet, under lock and key, there was a bloody scourge. Oftentimes this Protestant and Puritan divine had plied it on his own shoulders, laughing bitterly at himself the while, and smiting so much the more pitilessly because of that bitter laugh. So a bloody scourge. So he keeps in a locked closet a whip, which was used for punishing himself, and he plied it on his own shoulders. So this is like a short whip. It's not really long. I want to say it's 9 or 10 inches, like maybe the whole thing's a foot. So it's got a handle, and then it's got these little, I feel like it's 9. I feel like I don't know why that number's sticking with me, but 9 little straps. And so he beats himself with it as a form of punishment. It was his custom too, as it has been that of many other pious Puritans, to fast. Not, however, like them, in order to purify the body and render it the fitter medium of celestial illumination, but rigorously and until his knees trembled beneath him as an act of penance. So he fasts, which was common for Puritans. However, he takes it to the extreme. So he does it as a form of penance. He's trying to punish himself. And he basically starves himself because he feels like he deserves it. He kept vigils, likewise, night after night, sometimes in utter darkness, sometimes with a glimmering lamp, and sometimes viewing his own face in a looking-glass by the most powerful light which he could throw upon it. He thus typified the constant introspection wherewith he tortured, but could not purify himself. So not only does he whip himself and starve himself, but he also holds vigils, and the book's talked about that before. So he would stay up for hours, night after night. He would deprive himself of sleep, where he would just sit and think about what he's done and talk to God and pray about it. In these lengthened vigils, his brain often reeled and visions seemed to flit before him, perhaps seen doubtfully and by a faint light of their own, in the remote dimness of the chamber, or more vividly and close beside him within the looking-glass. Now it was a herd of diabolic shapes that grinned and mocked at the pale minister and beckoned him away with them. Now a group of shining angels who flew upward heavily, as sorrow-laden, but grew more ethereal as they rose. Now came the dead friends of his youth, and his white-bearded father with a saint-like frown, and his mother turning her face away as she passed by. Ghost of a mother, thinnest fantasy of a mother, methinks she might yet have thrown a pitying glance towards her son. And now, through the chamber which these spectral thoughts had made so ghastly, glided Hester Prynne, leading along little Pearl in her scarlet garb and pointing her forefinger first at the scarlet letter on her bosom and then at the clergyman's own breast. Okay, so the things mentioned in that paragraph are not things that are really there. His father, his mother, Hester, they didn't really walk through his room. These are like hallucinations that he's having. Now, why is he hallucinating or imagining? It could be because he's starving himself and depriving himself of sleep, or it could just be that guilty conscience making him kind of think about these things, imagine that they're there. None of these visions ever quite deluded him. At any moment, by an effort of his will, he could discern substances through their misty lack of substance and convince himself that they were not solid in their nature, like yonder table of carved oak or that big square leathern-bound and brazen-clasped volume of divinity. So when this happens, it says that he's never been fooled into thinking they were real. He always manages to be able to tell what's real and what's not. But for all that, they were, in one sense, the truest and most substantial things which the poor minister now dealt with. It is the unspeakable misery of a life so false as his, that it steals the pith and substance out of whatever realities there are around us, and which were meant by heaven to be the spirit's joy and nutriment. To the untrue man, the whole universe is false. It is impalpable. It shrinks to nothing within his grasp, and he himself, insofar as he shows himself in a false light, becomes a shadow, or indeed ceases to exist. The only truth that continued to give Mr. Dimmesdale a real existence on this earth was the anguish in his inmost soul, and the undissembled expression of it in his aspect. Had he once found power to smile and wear a face of gaiety, there would have been no such man. On one of those ugly nights, which we have faintly hinted at, but forborne to picture forth, the minister started from his chair. A new thought had struck him. There might be a moment's peace in it. Attiring himself with as much care as if it had been for public worship, and precisely in the same manner, he stole softly down the staircase, undid the door, and issued forth. So it's the middle of the night. He's been up holding one of these vigils, and he has an idea. He might be able to gain some peace from it. And so he gets dressed as if he's going to church, and it's the middle of the night, but out the door he goes, and that is where the chapter ends. So, quick recap of chapter 11. We know at the beginning, it's very obvious at this point that Chillingworth knows that Dimmesdale was Hester's lover, and Chillingworth has begun psychologically tormenting Dimmesdale thanks to this revelation that was granted to him from where he doesn't really care. So this, of course, is hinting or foreshadowing the idea that this gift may not have come from God. Dimmesdale punishes himself. As he ponders his sin, he attempts to fake confession of the sin in the hopes that it would make him feel better, but he knows that he goes about it the wrong way. Like he knows that they're going to respect him that much more when he does it, but he does it anyway, which is a sin in itself. And then at the end there, he's tortured, and so he thinks that he's thought of a way in order to get some relief for himself, and he heads outside in the middle of the night, and that's how the chapter ends. In the next chapter, chapter 12, it's called The Minister's Vigil, and it picks up right where this one leaves off. So at the beginning of 12, you find out just where he was headed in the middle of the night.